Somebody is watching you right now. Not me, not some shadowy agency, though sure, maybe them too. I'm talking about something older and stranger than surveillance. I'm talking about the ache for solitude, the bone-deep human craving to have one square foot of the world that belongs to nobody but you, a place where no one judges you, no one interrupts you, and no one asks why you've been in there for 20 minutes. We treat this as a given. We have bedrooms with doors that actually close. We have bathrooms with locks. We have noise-canceling headphones, do not disturb settings, and the sacred art of turning off every light in the house, so the person at the door assumes nobody's home. But here's a question that will quietly ruin your evening. What did people do before any of that existed? What happened when your entire world was one smoky room? 30 other bodies breathing the same air, and all you wanted was 5 minutes alone with your own thoughts. This is a story of privacy before privacy was invented, and it is stranger, older, and more complicated than you'd think. Let's rewind to the beginning of us. For roughly 190,000 of the 200,000 or so years Homo sapiens has existed, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers, moving in small bands, maybe 20 to 50 people across open land in search of food and water, with essentially no personal space to speak of. Really sit with what that means. You woke up surrounded by people. You ate surrounded by people. You fought, laughed, mourned, and fell in love surrounded by the exact same faces, day after day, for your entire life. There was no home to retreat to in the way we mean it now. No apartment, no hallway, no door to shut behind you. Existence was communal by default, from your first breath to your last. Archaeologists digging through the remains of these early camps have noticed something telling. They almost never find signs of separate sleeping areas. No partitions, no private nooks, just one shared floor where everyone bedded down together like a litter of puppies. So did these people even want privacy, or is that a much later invention, right up there with income tax and the passive-aggressive office email? This is where anthropologists start disagreeing in interesting ways. Some argue privacy isn't a natural human need at all, but byproduct of civilization, hierarchy, and private property. Before there was anything worth hiding, before status was something to protect, before secrets had value, maybe nobody needed to be alone. And there's real evidence backing this up. Contemporary hunter-gatherer groups still living in the Amazon, in parts of Central Africa, in remote pockets of Papua New Guinea, have been studied at length, and researchers keep finding the same pattern. Almost no concept of physical privacy exists. The Piraha of the Brazilian Amazon, for example, traditionally sleep close together, carry out nearly every activity in shared space, and simply don't operate with a cultural notion that certain behaviors or information should be hidden from the group. It isn't that they lack a sense of individual identity. It's that, for them, the self doesn't require a locked door to exist. Before you romanticize this as some kind of pure, liberated way of living, though, consider the cost. Everything you do is open to communal commentary. Sneeze strangely, and the whole camp has opinions. Wake up in a foul mood, and there is nowhere on the entire planet you can go to just quietly be miserable by yourself. Sounds exhausting, honestly. But even in these ancient societies, privacy wasn't fully absent. It just wore a different costume. The earliest form of human privacy wasn't a wall or a lockbox. It was a behavior. Anthropologists call it civil inattention. An unspoken social contract to simply not look, not comment, not acknowledge something even when you obviously noticed it. You still see this today. Two strangers avoiding eye contact in an elevator. A couple having a hushed argument at the next table. Someone quietly crying on public transport while everyone else studies their shoes. Modern urban life runs on the same invisible agreement. I will pretend not to see what I clearly see, and you will return the favor when it's my turn. This was privacy's original form. Not architecture, but etiquette, a collective decision to mind your own business. It worked because in tight-knit hunter-gatherer bands, where survival hinged on cooperation, breaking that unwritten rule, gossiping maliciously, prying, forcing a confrontation, was genuinely risky. It could fracture the group at a moment nobody could afford instability. Social invisibility wasn't enforced by any court. It was enforced by the simple, brutal logic of group survival. Ancient humans had privacy. It just lived inside other people's willingness to look away, not inside walls. Then agriculture arrived and complicated everything. Somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago, in several parts of the world independently, humans began cultivating their own food instead of chasing it. They stopped wandering. They built permanent settlements. And for the first time in the species' history, there was something concrete worth protecting. Stored grain, livestock, a specific patch of land. The instant you own something, you need privacy, because privacy is fundamentally about control. Control over your possessions, your information, your body, your choices. And you can't hold on to any of that if anyone can wander into your life uninvited. This is the moment walls stopped being purely functional shelter and started becoming something else entirely, the architecture of the private self. At sites like Catalhoyuk in modern Turkey, dating back roughly 9,000 years, archaeologists have found settlements so densely packed that houses shared walls entirely, with almost no streets at all, residents entering their homes through openings in the roof. And yet inside those cramped structures, distinct zones start appearing. Raised sleeping platforms, dedicated cooking areas, separate storage spaces. People were beginning, for the very first time, to organize their inner lives spatially. The house was becoming a container for the self, not just a barrier against weather. Something archaeology rarely spotlights, though, is what this meant for children. In these early farming communities, kids had essentially zero private life, and remarkably, nobody at the time seemed to think that was strange. Children slept in the same room as their parents and siblings and witnessed the entire range of adult experience: arguments, grief, sickness, intimacy, completely unfiltered, from a very young age. This wasn't neglect or dysfunction. It was simply the texture of life when walls were still a fairly new technology and space was scarce. And interestingly, children in these settings built their private lives out of something other than architecture. Time. The hours spent alone foraging, herding animals, or hauling water became a substitute for a locked door. Movement itself was freedom, and the errand that took you briefly outside the settlement became a doorway into your own head. Even now, in communities without the luxury of a private bedroom, kids instinctively carve out private space through motion rather than walls. A tree that says to climb, a particular rock by the river, a tiny imaginary kingdom stitched together out of a landscape that belongs, at least psychologically, entirely to them. The human need for a private space doesn't vanish just because nobody built one for you. It just finds a different shape to occupy. Now let's talk about the thing everybody's thinking about and nobody wants to say out loud. Toilets, or rather, the long stretch of history where they barely existed. Understanding ancient privacy means understanding that for most of human existence, bodily functions were about as unprivate as it gets. And this isn't a minor footnote. It's central to the whole story. In prehistoric life, elimination happened wherever and whenever the body demanded it, communally or alone, with no designated space, no etiquette, and certainly no awkward hallway small talk while waiting for the bathroom. Even the great classical civilizations didn't fix this the way you'd hope. The Romans, architects of aqueducts, roads, concrete, and no small amount legal philosophy, built public latrines known as forica, long stone benches with holes cut into them, positioned over a channel of running water. You sat shoulder to shoulder with total strangers. You chatted. Surviving graffiti and literary references suggest people ran into acquaintances, conducted small business, and traded gossip while doing their business, quite literally. The Romans weren't embarrassed by any of this. If anything, they were proud of their sanitation engineering, and given what preceded and followed the empire, they had a reasonable case for that pride. The wealthy, naturally, found workarounds, because the wealthy have always found workarounds to every inconvenience in every era. Private chamber pots, servants to handle disposal, separate toilet chambers tucked inside larger villas. The link between money and privacy is ancient, and it has never really broken. Speaking of wealth, let's turn to ancient Egypt, because Egypt is where the architecture of private life gets genuinely fascinating. Ordinary Egyptian homes were modest mud brick structures, usually 1 or 2 rooms, with the entire family living in close quarters. Privacy remained mostly behavioral. The concept existed, but the physical infrastructure to support it largely didn't. In elite households, though, among nobles, priests, and high officials, something new emerges. Multi-room villas with dedicated sleeping chambers, reception halls kept separate from private family quarters, even what we might call backstage spaces, areas of the home closed off entirely to guests and visitors. This matters enormously because it means that by roughly 3000 BC, some humans hadn't just developed a concept of private life. They'd built entire architectural systems to enforce it. As a visitor to a noble's household, you'd be received in specific, designated public rooms. You'd never see the family's private quarters. You'd never step into the spaces reserved for intimate daily life. Sound familiar? It's essentially how privacy still functions in formal social settings today. What's especially striking is that the Egyptians extended this obsession all the way into the afterlife. The Projet, literally house of eternity, was their word for the tomb and the burial chamber, the most intimate space imaginable. The resting place of the actual body was designed to be permanently sealed and private forever. The ancient Egyptians wanted privacy so desperately that they tried to engineer it directly into death itself. Let's cross continents to ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, birthplace of the first true urban civilizations on Earth. Cities like Uruk may have housed as many as 50,000 people by 3000 BC, an enormous concentration of humanity for the ancient world. And when that many people live packed together, privacy stops being a philosophical curiosity and becomes an urgent practical problem. Mesopotamian legal codes, most famously the Code of Hammurabi from around 1754 BC, revealed just how seriously this problem was taken. There are specific statutes governing property boundaries, unauthorized entry into someone's home, and the legal protection of domestic space from intrusion. This is genuinely remarkable. The home as a private, protected zone had become important enough to require formal codification in law. Breaking into someone's house was already treated as a grave crime nearly 4,000 years ago, and the punishment under Hammurabi's code was severe. The offender would be put to death right at the point of entry, then buried within a wall of the very house they tried to invade. Nobody in ancient Babylon was taking home invasion lightly. Ancient Greece gave the world philosophy, democracy, and the Olympics. It also left behind one of the most contradictory relationships with privacy in the ancient world. Public life in Greece was intensely, almost aggressively communal. The agora, the central public square, was the heartbeat of civic existence. Political argument, trade, philosophy, and socializing all played out in the open, visible to everyone. To be seen participating in public life was, quite literally, to count as a full citizen. And yet the Greek household, the oikos, was fiercely guarded and private. Here's where it gets complicated, though, because access to that privacy depended entirely on who you were. Citizen men moved freely between both worlds, engaging in the agora and retreating into the oikos whenever they chose, essentially getting the best of both systems. Greek women, particularly in Athens, were expected to remain almost entirely confined to the domestic sphere. Their private space functioned simultaneously as sanctuary and as cage. They weren't absent from public life by choice, but because visibility in public was treated as socially indecent for them. There's actually a word buried in this history worth noting. The Greek term for someone confined purely to private life, idiots, is the root of our modern word idiot. Because to the Greeks, a person who existed only in private and never engaged in public civic life was considered incomplete, lesser, lacking full participation in society. Privacy mattered to the Greeks, but too much of it, forced isolation, was treated as a kind of social death. There's one more ancient culture worth pausing on here, one that rarely gets enough credit for how thoughtfully approached private life: ancient China. During the Zhou dynasty and into the Warring States period, roughly 1000 to 200 BCE, Chinese philosophical traditions produced some of the most sophisticated thinking about the boundary between public and private that the ancient world ever produced. Confucianism, which came to dominate Chinese social philosophy, functioned almost like a detailed operating manual for navigating public roles versus the private self. The concept of li, or ritual propriety, dictated precisely how one should behave in every conceivable public context: how to greet a superior, how to sit at a formal meal, how to address a parent versus a friend versus a stranger. Every interaction had a prescribed form. Public life was performance in the most deliberate, structured sense imaginable. But Confucian thought was also keenly aware that this constant performance was exhausting, and that behind every public role sat a private person who genuinely needed room to simply exist without the choreography. The home, in Confucian thought, was where authentic relationships lived, the bond between husband and wife, between parent and child, held to an entirely different standard than public conduct and deliberately shielded from public formality, precisely because authenticity requires a space where performance can drop. This is a startlingly modern insight, the idea that public performance and private authenticity exists in permanent tension, and that private space is where the real self actually resides. It isn't a 21st century psychological discovery. It's a philosophical position that's roughly 2,500 years old. In ancient Rome, this dance between public and private was refined into something remarkably architectural and remarkably modern. Elite Roman homes, the domus, were physically designed to manage that boundary with real precision. The front portion of the house, the atrium and tablinum, functioned as semi-public space. Clients would arrive here for morning appointments with their patron. Business would be conducted, social obligations performed, your public face presented for an audience. But further back, past social barriers as real as any wall, even if you couldn't see them, sat the private quarters, the triclinium for intimate dinners among trusted company, the cubiculum for sleeping, the hortus, a private garden tucked away from outside eyes. These rooms weren't for visitors. They were for family, for genuine intimates, for the version of yourself that wasn't constantly performing. Roman law even codified this boundary explicitly, holding that the home was sacred. Domus est ue quic estetissimum refugium. A man's own home is as safe as refuge. A principle that predates the English common law notion that a man's home is his castle by well over a millennium. And yet Rome also wrestled visibly, sometimes painfully, with the tension between surveillance of power and a desire for a genuinely private life. Emperors kept informants. Neighborhoods had their watchers. Social existence was performance, and performance always needs an audience. The poet Marshall complained at length about the exhausting ritual of the early morning salutatio, when clients were obligated to show up at dawn to greet their patron, when everyone involved would have vastly preferred to still be asleep. Some frustrations of public life, apparently, haven't changed at all in 2,000 years. Perhaps the most overlooked and genuinely profound layer of ancient private life, though, is the inner one. Physical privacy, walls, doors, separate rooms, is one thing entirely. But what about mental privacy, the interior self that no outside observer can ever fully reach? Ancient humans understood this dimension with real depth, and in many ways guarded it more fiercely than any locked door ever could. Written journals, private correspondence, personal prayers directed only at a single deity. These were ancient technologies for protecting inner privacy. They built a space inside language itself, a sealed room hidden within communication, where a person could be honest in ways public life never permitted. The letters of the Roman statesman Cicero to his close friend Atticus, letters he explicitly stated were never meant for other eyes, reveal a man who, in public, projected total command of rhetoric and confidence, but who, in private, wrestled constantly with anxiety, grief, ambition, and self-doubt. The public Cicero and the private Cicero were, in many respects, two nearly separate people. That gap between the self we present outward and the self we protect inward is something deeply, permanently human. Ancient people didn't view this split as hypocrisy. They understood it as a necessary cost of living inside a civilization. So what does all of this add up to? It suggests that privacy isn't some modern luxury invented by suburbs and smartphones. It's a genuine human need, one that has been negotiated, fought over, built into architecture, encoded into law, and argued about philosophically for as long as humans have had anything worth concealing. It also shows that the specific shape privacy takes has always mirrored the social structure surrounding it. Hunter-gatherers relied on behavioral privacy. Agricultural societies built spatial privacy into their walls. Empires enshrined legal privacy in their codes, and every single stage, without exception, preserved a kind of psychological privacy, an inner life that persists no matter what walls, laws, or watchful neighbors surround it. And there's something uncomfortable buried in all of this, too. Privacy has never been distributed equally. It has always functioned as a privilege rather than a guarantee. The powerful accumulated more of it. The wealthy built literal walls around it. Women were frequently denied it, while men claimed it freely for themselves. Enslaved people, across nearly every ancient civilization examined here, had essentially none of it at all. In Roman households, enslaved people slept in the same spaces where they worked, in corridors, in nameless leftover corners, perpetually visible, perpetually available, permanently denied the refuge their enslavers took entirely for granted every single night. Historically, privacy has not been a right so much as a prize, one that had to be fought for, legislated into existence piece by piece, and in enormous portions of the world, still isn't guaranteed today. So the next time you close a bedroom door, put on a pair of headphones, or just sit somewhere alone for a few undisturbed minutes, understand that you're taking part in one of the oldest, quietest dramas our species has ever performed, the endless negotiation between the individual and the group, between the private self and the world pressing in around it. Ancient humans sat at the edges of their fires, staring into the dark, wanting exactly the same thing you want when you lock the bathroom door and just stand there for an extra 3 minutes doing absolutely nothing at all. That craving isn't modern. It isn't Western. It isn't a side effect of individualism, capitalism, or the invention of the single-family home. That need is as old as the very first human who looked around at the 29 other people they shared a fire with and quietly thought, I just need a minute.